Tell me where you saw him.
On a slab in the morgue, burned to a crisp.
Hello to all the classic people that are returning. I'm glad you're back. I want to welcome any new visitors. As a technical note, references and citations are listed for each show on the site at classicmovierev.com. Today on the Classic Movie Reviews podcast, we are taking on Dead Reckoning 1947. We are going with this classic film noir in honor of Noirvember.
And now back to 1943's fast-talking High Trousers.
Well, isn't this a fine song and dance?
What are you getting so hot about?
Keep your shirt on.
Where do you get off making remarks like that?
Supposing I say you're a lunkhead.
Well, I ain't much for supposing.
Well, supposing you were.
Well, maybe I'm through supposing and I'm fixed to start figuring.
Early on, this movie was not well respected. Lizabeth Scott was often panned as an actress. However, over time, fans began to appreciate her work more, and before she died, she was able to see an increased appreciation of her films. She is paired with the great Humphrey Bogart, Wallace Ford, and playing the heavy is Morris Karnofsky. The film has a fairly low rating of 7.1 on IMDb.com. It didn't do better on RottenTomatoes.com with 67% on both the tomato meter and on audience approval. The New York Times was kind to Bogart and said his dialogue was better than he had had in a while. They panned Lizabeth Scott for her deadpan expression and bad lines. I have to admit, there's one scene near the end where she doesn't even seem like she is trying. But overall, she fits this role pretty well. I have to say the film is not that bad. It is told mostly in flashback, and the bad guy and the femme fatale are worth the time. So let's get going with the actors. Actors.
Right. And I'm a Shakespearean actor.
The always fantastic Humphrey Bogart played Captain Rip Murdoch. However, at around 47 years old, he was a little long in the tooth for a returning World War II combat veteran. Lizabeth Scott played Dusty Chandler. Scott was first introduced in The Strange Loves of Martha Ivers, 1946. She was panned for some of her lines in the film, but hey, she didn't write it. Always tough Robert Ryan was uncredited as a detective. He was first covered in The Battle of the Bulge, 1965. Ray Teal was uncredited as a motorcycle cop. Teal was first covered in the western The Command, 1954. The always interesting Wallace Ford played McGee, a Yeg. Ford was first covered in the intense western Warlock, 1959. Morris Karnofsky played villain Martinelli. Karnofsky was born in St. Louis in 1897. Following high school, he attended Washington University in St. Louis. He began working in stock theater, and by 1928 he was in New York working on Broadway. Karnofsky was a founding member of the New York Group Theater. He was a member of the group from 1931 until its demise in 1940. Karnofsky's first serious film was The Life of Emile Zola, 1937. He continued with films such as Edge of Darkness, 1943, Film Noir Dead Reckoning, 1947, Cyrano de Bergerac, 1950, and Film Noir Gun Crazy, 1950. In Hollywood, Karnofsky was a founder of the Actors Project and was active in the Communist Party. In 1952, Elia Kazan and Sterling Hayden testified before the Un-American House Un-American Activities Committee and named names. Karnofsky was called before the committee and refused to name names. He was blacklisted from movies. However, he was able to continue to act on stage. Karnofsky made other movies but was not able to restart his career. He died in 1992 at the age of 94. William Prince was cast as Sergeant Johnny Drake. Prince was born in 1913 in New York State. He began working in films with Destination Tokyo, 1943. Other good films include Objective Burma, 1946, Film Noir Dead Reckoning, 1947, and Cyrano de Bergerac, 1950. However, his career didn't catch fire until he switched to television generally and soap operas specifically. He worked on television and did an occasional movie until 1994. Films during this period included The Stepford Wives, 1975, Network, 1976, and Spies Like Us, 1985. He died in 1996 at the age of 83. Marvin Miller played deranged killer Kraus. Miller was born in St. Louis in 1913. After high school, he attended Washington University in St. Louis. At university, he studied drama and began professional radio work in his freshman year. Following graduation, he moved to Chicago and worked on the radio as well as acting. His first movie was Blood on the Sun, 1945, and starred James Cagney. He appeared in film noir such as The Brasher Doubloon, 1947, and Dead Reckoning, 1947. Other movies include Deadline at Dawn, 1946, The Golden Horde, 1951, and Peking Express, 1951. He continued to work in film and television until 1985, including voice work on animated series. He had 2 uncredited voice roles of extreme note. They are Forbidden Planet, 1956, and The Agony and the Ecstasy, 1965. He was the voice of Robbie the Robot on Forbidden Planet. He was also a television game show host on The Millionaire, 1955 to 1960. He died in 1985 before his last film was released. George Chandler played bartender Louis Ord. Chandler was born in Illinois in 1898. Chandler served in the U.S. Army during World War I. After the war, he attended the University of Illinois and earned a living as a jazz violinist. Chandler worked in vaudeville and began making shorts in 1928. The Fatal Glass of Beer, 1933, starring W.C. Fields, is considered to be one of his best. Chandler was a prolific actor and has an amazing 462 film and television credits. Director William A. Wellman cast Chandler in 20 films he directed. Some of Chandler's better-known movies include Libeled Lady, 1936, A Star is Born, 1937, In Old Chicago, 1938, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, Tobacco Road, 1941, The Oxbow Incident, 1942, Roxy Hart, 1942, Since You Went Away, 1944, Battleground, 1949, and The High and the Mighty, 1954. Chandler died in 1985. Story.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
In Gulf City, a beaten and bruised Captain Rip Murdoch, Humphrey Bogart, now in civilian clothes, is wandering the streets trying to avoid the police. He ducks into a church to hide. Rip sees 2 priests talking, one in robes and the other a military uniform. He speaks to the military chaplain, Father Logan, James Bell, who is known for parachuting with the men in World War II. They make it clear that Rip is not Catholic, which seems a little odd.
Father, over here, sir.
Yes?
Father, I gotta talk to you. I'm a stranger here, and I gotta tell somebody about this thing while I can, in case anything happens to me.
Happens to you? Why?
If you'll just listen, sir. I'm sorry it has to be here in the church, but...
You're not a Catholic, my boy?
No, I'm not. But you're Father Logan, aren't you? The jumping padre, always the first one out of the plane. You don't know me, but I've heard about you. See, I'm a paratrooper, too.
Rip says he must tell his story to someone he can trust. Rip says the cops and some rough gangsters are after him. He says that a few days earlier, he and Sergeant Johnny Drake, William Prince, were flown from France on a special bomber. They didn't know why they were being sent back. They were picked up by a colonel in New York and put on a train for Washington, D.C. Pre-war, Johnny was a professor and Rip ran a fleet of taxis in St. Louis. Does this mean he is a small-time gangster? Johnny always puts his college pen in his mouth when he changes clothes. He and Rip had talked about a girl Johnny knew back home that has a husky voice. Rip picks the pocket of the colonel and is trying to find out information when they are busted by the colonel. Johnny drops his pen and it says, John Joseph Preston, Yale, 1940. Clearly not the name he joined the military with. Rip fesses up and finally the colonel tells him that they are being taken to Washington. Johnny is going to get the Congressional Medal of Honor and Rip will be getting the Distinguished Service Cross. Johnny is not happy about the news and being shown on the newsreels. In Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, some reporters come to the train. Rip goes outside and Johnny ducks out the back and jumps another train. Later, Rip calls Yale and tries to get the address of John Joseph Preston. In Philly, Rip tells the general that he's going after Johnny, but he doesn't want the Army investigators involved. It also seems he refuses his medal. Rip travels to the last town where Preston lived, Gulf City, Florida. All of the exterior filming took place in St. Petersburg, Florida. When Rip checks into the hotel, someone has already made a room reservation for him. The desk clerk gives him a message and it includes the name Geronimo. This is what early U.S. paratroopers shouted as they jumped out of the airplane, so he knows it's from Johnny. Rip waits 48 hours, sweating and smelling jasmine. Tired of waiting, Rip goes to the local newspaper to look for stories that happened just before Johnny enlisted. 5 weeks before Johnny enlisted, there was a front-page story where a rich realtor was murdered. His wife, Dusty Chandler, Lizabeth Scott, caused the murder, and Johnny had confessed before escaping. The main witness was Louis Ord, George Chandler. Rip goes back to his room and wonders why Johnny would have come back to Gulf City. On the radio, he hears about a 2-day-old car crash with a burned body in it. He heads to the morgue. Police Lieutenant Kincaid, Charles Crane, gives Rip a hard time about wanting to see the body. Kincaid takes him back and begins pulling drawers. He finally shows the burned body. Kincaid says everything was taken off the body before it was burned. The only item is a hunk of melted gold with black enamel.
The only thing my boys picked up was a hunk of melted gold like a tooth. Only it's too big for a tooth, and it's got some black stuff on it.
Black enamel and gold. Johnny's senior society pen.
Johnny's Yale pen. Rip cuts out before Kincaid can check his story. Rip heads back to his room, and finally he remembers the witness, Louis Ord. Ord was a waiter at the Sanctuary Club. The maitre d', Krause, Marvin Miller, is acting weird like he knows Rip. The club has a Cuban band playing and people are dancing and having a good time. He goes to the bar and Ord is the bartender. Ord seems ready to jump out of his skin when Rip starts quizzing him about Johnny. When Rip tells his name, Ord is happy because he has heard of the captain and Johnny has been hiding at his place until 2 days prior. Ord says the only other person that Johnny had seen was Dusty. Ord says he has a letter from Johnny, but he won't give it to him in the club. Krause and the other bartenders are crowding him. They agree to meet in the morning. Rip hears Dusty's husky voice.
Hello, Louie.
Good evening, Mrs. Chandler. A Ramus Gin Fizz?
Nobody can make him the way you can.
But he sees her gams first. Rip strikes up a conversation with her, and again Krause butts in. Dusty and Rip get a table. She wants to know where Johnny is. Rip doesn't like her at all, especially since she testified against Johnny. Rip is about to tell her that Johnny is dead, but Dusty is called to the stage to sing. Not a real good singing voice. Ouch. During the song, Krause has words with Ord. After the song, Rip asks her to dance. She is wearing jasmine perfume. He wants to have his hand on her back so he could see if the news was a real shock.
Still wear the same perfume, don't you?
Tell me where you saw him.
She wears jasmine, he said.
Please.
He used to call you Dusty. It was sort of a love name you had between the two of you, wasn't it?
Tell me where you saw him.
On a slab in the morgue, burned to a crisp.
She passes the test. Mr. Martinelli, Morris Karnofsky, who owns the club, comes to their table. He invites Dusty to play some roulette. She says she is okay and they go to the back. Rip thinks that Martinelli ordered her to gamble. Dusty loses a lot of money. Rip thinks she is paying off. She is $16,000 down. Rip goes to the craps table. Krause is now the croupier. Krause changes the dice and Rip starts to cash out. Martinelli gives him the original dice back and he ends up $16,000 ahead. They go to Martinelli's office to be paid off. Rip has taken the loaded dice from Krause. Martinelli says he is connected to Detroit mobsters and Al Barreto from St. Louis. Rip also knows Al. Ord brings in the drinks and tries to warn Rip that the drink is spiked. Rip has to drink the drink to keep Ord out of trouble. Rip wakes up in his hotel after being drugged. The phone rings and it's Dusty. She had been drugged also. The dead body of Ord was laying in the next bed. So now Rip knows that Martinelli is involved in the murder. Rip takes Ord's body and hides it in an industrial laundry bin. It is not long until Police Lieutenant Kincaid and another detective show up and search his room. Kincaid asks how long he has known Dusty. The story is that Rip and Ord had a fight at the club the night before. After the police are gone, Rip calls Dusty. He asks her to park in the hotel garage at 1 p.m. and meet him in the lobby. She's wearing a nice head wrap with a matching bow tie. Kincaid has the lobby staked out. Rip calls Al and asks about Martinelli. Al provides him with a man that can help, named McGee, Wallace Ford. Rip sees Kincaid and has a bellhop page Kincaid. The bellhop is none other than Matthew Stymie Beard of the Little Rascals fame. When Kincaid is distracted, Rip and Dusty drive away. Dusty takes him to a place, the Dixie, near Flamingo Beach. Dusty tries to figure everything out during the drive. Rip engages in some full-on 1940s sexism. She confesses that she was not really in love with Johnny. Rip tells Dusty about the letter and Ord. He thinks Martinelli has the letter, and he believes it is written in their military unit code. He also tells her that McGee is a safecracker, or a yegg. Dusty says Johnny saved her from being murdered by her husband. In the fight, the husband's gun went off and he was killed. She is concerned that Rip doesn't believe her story. They head back into town and head for McGee's house.
I couldn't stand there looking at her. I had to keep moving. Her story about Johnny sounded real. I'd buy it for now on approval, as the dolls say. Only maybe I was buying a lot more than that and didn't know it.
McGee has a bunch of military armament in the living room. Rip points out the type of safe he needs cracked. When McGee hears that the mark is Martinelli, he backs out. He does teach Rip how to open the safe. After they leave, Rip finally lets her in on the fact that Ord's body is in the trunk. She blows through a four-way stop and is pulled over by a motorcycle cop, Ray Teal. Rip tells him that they are getting married. The cop gives him a break and lets him go. When it got dark, they drove over to Martinelli's house and dropped the body of Ord off. Dusty calls the police and tips off the police about the body at Martinelli's. Rip calls his hotel, but we don't hear what is said. Dusty drops Rip off at the back of the club and he sends her home, but not before kissing her. Rip watches Martinelli leave to go meet the police. Rip goes in the back door and up to Martinelli's office. Rip finds that the safe is open. He goes through the papers and the letter is not there. He begins looking around the desk for the letter. He finds a decoding sheet and by chance he finds the letter. Someone knocks on the door. He smells jasmine and then someone hits him in the head with a blackjack. When he wakes up, Krause and Martinelli are there. They want Rip to decode the letter. Martinelli says Krause is a psycho and he will leave him to torture Rip. Krause wraps his hands and begins beating on Rip. Later, Martinelli returns. They prop Rip up in a chair and Martinelli begins quizzing him again. Rip tells that he is expecting a call from his hotel to this office at 10:45. Martinelli answers the phone and says Rip has not been there. Rip says the hotel manager has a letter that will be turned over to the police if he is not back by 11:45. Martinelli sends Krause back to the hotel with Rip, but there is no letter implicating the two in the murder of Johnny. When Rip and Krause get out at the hotel, Lieutenant Kincaid and 3 officers approach them. Rip tells them that Krause has a gun. Krause hits Kincaid and jumps in the car and escapes. Rip takes off in the other direction on foot. It goes back to the church where Rip is telling the chaplain the story. Rip realizes that the jasmine he smelled was from Dusty.
As I've been telling it to you, I've been thinking. I'm not so sure. I remember there was a whiff of jasmine just before I was knocked out. Maybe it was her. Suddenly I got a feeling I know it was.
The chaplain goes to get Rip a drink and Rip takes off. He heads to Dusty's apartment. She is shocked when she sees him, but it could be because of the beating or because she expected him to be dead. She gives him a drink. He talks about smelling the jasmine before he was knocked out. Dusty says jasmine grows all over the South. She pledges her undying love. Rip says that Johnny told him about her killing her own husband. She admits the gun was in her hand and Johnny took the rap for her. She had told Martinelli the story after Johnny disappeared. Martinelli said he would get rid of the gun, but he has used it for blackmail. She says she will call the police and confess. Rip says there is a telephone. She makes the call, but Rip takes the phone out of her hand before she can confess. They kiss, and she is in love. She tells what a hard life she has had, and now she wants to go away with Rip. Rip passes out on the couch, knowing he will be turned over to Martinelli if he is wrong about Dusty. Rip sleeps for 36 hours, and his face is healed. It's a miracle. Dusty says Rip can get back into the taxi business, and they won't have to touch her money. Rip says they'll have to stop in Washington, D.C. Rip leaves to go find McGee. Later, McGee shows up at Dusty's apartment. McGee says Rip is coming up the back way so the police won't see him. He drops off a gun and some napalm grenades. Rip is going to see Martinelli and he wants to get the gun with Dusty's fingerprints. He wants her to open the back door to Martinelli's office. The buzzer rings and it's Lieutenant Kincaid. Rip gets the jump on him and takes his gun. They tie Kincaid up and leave him in the closet. They tell the maid, Hyacinth, Ruby Dandridge, to wait until 12:30 and let Kincaid out and give him his gun back. It's raining hard and Dusty drives to the front of the club. Krause takes Dusty to the office and says Rip is at the bar. Dusty opens the back door and Rip pulls a gun on Martinelli. Krause comes in and he gets the jump on him too. Rip smacks Krause and knocks him out. Rip asks Martinelli to take the gun out of the safe. Martinelli says Dusty knows it's not in the safe because she checked that after she blackjacked Rip. Martinelli then says Dusty is his wife and she was still married to him when she married Chandler. Martinelli says he and Dusty were in on the murder to get Chandler's money. Rip pulls the grenade. Martinelli says that when Dusty married Chandler, they only expected him to live for 6 months. When they found out he was healthy, they planned to murder him. When Johnny had a fight with Chandler in the club, Martinelli decided it was time to commit the murder. Rip throws a grenade and part of the room starts burning. They say Johnny was killed by accident. Krause says the gun is inside the desk. Rip throws the other grenade and Krause has to jump out the window. Martinelli and Rip run down the back stairs. Martinelli runs out the door first and Dusty shoots him down. Rip gets in the car with Dusty and says they are going to the police because she just tried to murder him. He tells her she's going to fry for this. Rip says that he loved Johnny more than her. She pulls a gun and demands that he give over Chandler's murder weapon. He speeds up to keep her from shooting him. Finally, she shoots him at point blank in the ribs. The car crashes. Dusty is being given the last rites when she wakes up. Rick has his arm in a sling and looks fine. Lieutenant Kincaid is taking down the story. The nurse lets him know that Dusty is not going to make it. Rip gets a call from the general and says he has cleared everything up. He goes to Dusty and her makeup is perfect. Knowing she is going to die, she asks to hold his hands. He gives her kind words as she does one of the worst death scenes ever. I'll be back with conclusions and the world-famous short summary following a word from our sponsors. World-famous short summary: don't get caught sniffing the jasmine. I hope you enjoyed today's show. You can find connections to social media and email on the site at classicmovierev.com or in the podcast show notes. If you enjoyed the show, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. If you've already subscribed, you can tell a friend, colleague, or family member about the show or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show get found. If you want to comment, suggest a movie, or help out, contact me by email at jec@classicmovierev.com. Beware the Moors.